thank you for coming to our ongoing series of presidential lectures here at the King's College. If you go to the final resting place of Thomas Jefferson, all of the accolades that one could put on his tombstone, he only has a couple of things, one of which is author of the Declaration of Independence. There may be a few things for which I will be remembered as president of the King's College. I think one of those will be bringing in Amity Shlaes as presidential scholar at the King's College. I had a meeting with a very important friend of King's last November on the same day that the press release went up and out that Amity was coming on board as presidential scholar and historian in residence. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Amity Shlaes, good job." For those of you that do not know her, Amity Shlaes is a widely respected author and columnist. She brings her expertise in politics, history, and economics to the King's College as our presidential scholar. She is the author of 4, count 'em 4, New York Times bestsellers, including The Forgotten Man. One thing that is near and dear to my heart, she is also a New York Times bestselling author of a graphic novel of The Forgotten Man, and also Coolidge, the famous biography. She also served as a member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board and senior columnist at the Financial Times and Bloomberg, columnist for Forbes. She also writes for the National Review and is the chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Her title for today's talk has Moxie. It is an interrogative. Better than Reagan? Calvin Coolidge, the forgotten president. Would you please join me in welcoming Amity Shlaes.
I'm going to say, can you hear me? Is it my? I'm going to say thank you in the middle to President Greg. So don't think I forgot. So happy to be here. And I hope you call me on the Moxie, on the challenge. It is a challenge. Better than Reagan. Oh my gosh, right? Is that possible? When I was traveling back to New York, I've been traveling this week, I was reading that the current president of the United States, that would be President Obama, has a plan for entitlements in his budget. That means the entitlements will grow 75% in 10 years. Whoa, that seems like a lot, right? But I was also reviewing a Republican tax plan of one of the wonderful candidates. And the wonderful Republican tax plan added, just about $2 trillion to the debt. So there you have it. It's a bipartisan impulse. Every politician wants to spend more, right? And so we asked a question, should government spend? And the answer comes in a very broad range. The answer is either yes or yes, a lot. That is, we have an assumption, which is, I'm going to hold this up actually so I can really see you. That is an assumption that the government cannot not spend. It's just the way it's got to be. A government has to say yes all the time. And then you want to ask yourself, some of you are economics students, history students, just generally interested souls, what underlies this assumption that the government always has to spend? And the first that we hear a lot, especially since the financial crisis, is government has to say yes to spending because if we don't spend, what? The economy won't grow. Stimulus. And the second thing is, well, you can't get someone who is opposed to spending elected anyhow, right? Or if he or she does get elected, as a naysayer, and then, well, what happens if he keeps saying no in office? Well, pretty soon he gets what? De-elected, right? So that's where we are. That's America. And even Ronald Reagan, and that's why I dare challenge him, did not spend less in office than his predecessors. As you probably know, spending went up under President Reagan. Reagan said yes. Reagan liked some entitlements. So my job today, very short job, is only one thing, is to show that an American leader in a century not that far from our century, the preceding century, not way back to Thomas Jefferson, can say no and not hurt the economy and also get elected. Those three things, and that president was Calvin Coolidge, and that's the cover from my book. So he was the 30th president of the United States. That means he served in the 1920s. He came after Warren Harding, about whom I'll talk today, and before Herbert Hoover, just to refresh your memory. And when he was elected in 1924. Mr. Harding unfortunately died, and Coolidge, the vice president, became president, but then he had his own election in 24. I know you think he's obscure, right? He's a little bit obscure. So, I like this picture because it's actually a 19th century picture, the hat and all, but he has, when you look at it, a very 20th century face. You might know some stories about him, that he was supposed to be a sour face. Well, he didn't show his teeth very much. Can you see that smile? He didn't have very good teeth. Okay. They didn't have cosmetic, they didn't have implants in those days. They didn't have bonding, they didn't have whitener, right? He was quiet. You've heard that, right? Silent Cal. Has everyone heard that? And some people called him the accident of an accident. Ooh, what's that about? You know, Alice Longworth, who was the daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, a very different kind of president, said that look at the picture again, that Coolidge looked as though he'd been weaned on a pickle. Okay, all right. But he is worth knowing more about. He served 67 months, just for your data points, from 1923 into 1929. And if you want to learn one thing about him, he actually left the federal budget lower than when he came in. So I know you're saying, because you're economists maybe, is that real Amity or is that nominal? Is that per capita, right? It's real, nominal. It's there. Nowadays when we say, he cut the budget, we mean what? He reduced the increase in the budget. That's what baseline budgeting is about in Washington. Some of you may have worked there. Coolidge actually cut the budget in peacetime. So how did he do that? And I lied. There's one other thing you want to remember about him, and this does relate to Reagan. Taxes were high, and he cut the tax rate down to 25%, the top tax rate that the rich people pay. And why does that matter? That matters because the proudest thing that Ronald Reagan achieved at home was he cut the tax rate too, but Reagan cut it only down to 28. And this is a contest of numbers. These numbers are really important. You want to know them just like you know the names of the presidents. A top marginal rate of 25%, the Coolidge top marginal rate, is pretty low. Not really beaten in history. There are some footnotes, but just mark it in your brain. 25% top marginal rate. And everything was pretty good. It was a good decade. So if Coolidge was a Scrooge and always said no, he was a Scrooge who begat plenty. Well, how do you do that, right? Forgotten president, the hero you never knew that you had. Who is he? So how he did it, and I want to fold Warren Harding, his wonderful predecessor, into this story, takes a minute to tell. And I really am grateful, one, to have this great opportunity to teach at your school, to get to know you, and to President Gregg, who made that possible, and Vice President Kimberly, all of you, for bringing me here, for you to give your lunch hour, everything for this chance. This is a story about not just presidents and not just process and laws, though they're in there, but also human temperament and character. And that's one reason it does take so long to tell. So if you start with the story, when does this story of Coolidge begin, and politics and money? It begins after a crisis. There's some parallels, as now. This crisis, our crisis was the financial crisis, right? Their crisis was World War I. 1918, 1919, the war is ending, but they're kind of an uneven situation after World War I. You want to imagine how disruptive was World War I. Well, there was universal conscription. The government got all involved in the economy. The most important industry at that time was the railroad, and during World War I, towards the end, the government nationalized the railroad. It took over the railroad. Then later, it denationalized the railroad. Well, that's confusing, right? A lot of things were going on. After the war, some sectors did real well. Here's another similarity. The name of the sector that did real well was energy. But the other sectors maybe didn't do as well, and there was kind of troubling unemployment, and the prices were way up, but they weren't allowed to say it was inflation. Does that sound familiar too, right? Oh, we don't have inflation, we just have higher prices, right? Oh, we're not allowed to say that, right? There was a small veteran who came back. He was good at procurement and supplies, and he started a business with another veteran in a medium-sized town. That was Kansas City. They were going to sell clothing to vets who go back in civilian life. They get a nice suit, get a nice tie, get a nice vest, and their business did not make it. And the small veteran said, well, maybe the private sector isn't the greatest thing after all. And the name of that small veteran in Kansas City with the haberdasher shop was Harry Truman. Right? So that's the decade. Oh, by the way, did the government have money? No. There's fiscal trouble. The taxes were up into the 70s. The government had borrowed 10 times more than ever before to pay for World War I. And at least two groups are pressing the government to say, yes. Right? The first was farmers. If those of you who follow agriculture know that farming prices, commodities went up around the end of World War I. We were feeding Europe in World War I, and then they went down. What's that about? And a lot of farms were failing, and the farmers wanted some kind of entitlement, some kind of regular check, please. Given we're the breadbasket of the country, please, right? And well, since those farms were failing, their case seemed pretty good. And farmers, right now, farmers are what percent of our population? Does anyone know?
Not 3%?
Right, 2, right? Maybe 1. And at that time, Mr. Peterson knows this because he is in our class. But also because he's the debate coach, right? And at that time, there were about 30% were farmers. So that's a lot of voters asking for an entitlement, right? The number of votes matters. And the second group also had a lot of votes because of that universal conscription I told you about. They were the veterans, and they wanted a regular payment. Well, what's wrong with that? There was no Social Security then, and what about the veterans? Did they have penicillin in those days? What happened if your leg got shot and then it got infected? Maybe, right? Maybe your leg was just not getting better. Maybe, did your wife work in the early 20s? It's pretty dire, right? A lot of the vets were disabled. They wanted a regular payment for their service. Maybe their, what we would call a pension, they called it a bonus. Oh, there's one other group I do want to mention. Workers, aggressive unions wanted better pay because everyone was lying about that inflation and their wages weren't going up the way the prices were. So the way this starts to get interesting is that in 1920, nonetheless, one party, the Republicans, campaigns not on yes to these very lovely and lovable groups, but on no. And that's because the leaders, this party didn't think that the government could get in the habit of paying all these groups. It would never end. And one of the, I think I want to just go to my next slide, right? Nope. Go forward. There they are. That's Warren Harding. So he was the top candidate, the presidential candidate, Warren. He was an ebullient senator from Ohio. He was like a frat brother. Everybody loved him. And he's very kind. But he said, I'm going to say no. So that was an attractive candidate, a lovable person who can convey bad news. I told you this is about character. And the second was this sort of very tight governor from Massachusetts. That's Calvin Coolidge, who is to Harding's left. and he was the law and order guy. And the two of them campaigned no spending, no expansion of unions, no entitlements, no farm bonus, no veterans, blah, blah, blah. And Harding fancied himself a writer. He was a writer. He had a newspaper in Marion, Ohio, and he used this word to describe what he sought for America with the note, normalcy. Did anyone see that in the AP textbook when you're studying for the high school? U.S. History AP, that incredibly difficult SAT 2 on American history, or the AP, right? Normalcy, and I know I encountered it around that time, and I thought, normalcy doesn't sound very interesting. I don't want to be a cog. Sounds like Lego, right? Normal, be normal, normalcy. But when I went back and looked this up for the Coolidge book, I found by normalcy, Harding meant something different. He meant the environment should be normal so we can start companies and do what we want and have fun. Well, that's a very different kind of normalcy and begins to be likable. And Coolidge was a real stickler for English. He was kind of an education snob. And he didn't like that word that Harding was using all the time, normalcy, for what America needs. Well, maybe that mixed Latin and Greek. I'm not sure, right? I don't like that. So Coolidge, the vice presidential candidate, had another name for what they sought. He said, reduce economic uncertainty. And that also begins to sound familiar, right? Anyway, remember there's prohibition in this time, and these two gents said, well, in order to ask people to go along with us saying no, we have to be models, right? The White House, well, if the White House has to drink orange juice, if the rest of the country is drinking orange juice, right? We have to be very virtuous in order to pull this off. The second novelty, they win, okay? Wow, the no wins. Third, when they get in office, they start to say no. If you've ever seen about the Roosevelts, whether it's Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, well, they're all about action, right? They're action men presidents. These people were different. Harding and Coolidge wanted to say no and to not do, first do no harm, like a doctor, right? Hippocratic. But what was that about? And I want you to forgive me because I'm not very good at accents, and I'm going to read some of these people's statements because they're so different from what any politician of either party would say today about not doing instead of doing, and the virtue of holding back, that they're astounding. So here's what Harding said now that he's elected president in the inauguration, and I'm going to be Warren Harding. Are we ready? No altered system will work a miracle, said the president. Any experiment will add to confusion. No experiments, right? No change. No change we can believe in, right? Our best assurance lies in efficient administration of our proven system. Ooh, right? Makes you just sit right up. And Harding also did say no at first, very, very much. He went down to the Senate and he got all his brothers in the Senate, and I told you he was much loved, to pass the law, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, that gave the executive the power to, it's a verb you've heard, sequester. Ooh, to keep money back from the big spending departments, right? To hold money back. And it is a trick to get Congress to vote for something that takes away power from Congress. So you want to give Harding that credit, right? And next year, President Gregg is going to be introducing the Harding revisionist to you because I'm feeling bad for Harding at this speech. But anyway, Harding did that, and he said no to the farmers. That was really hard because farmers are lovable, but he just thought it was, why? And their farms were failing. If you look at the data, we're studying that in our class. But, well, maybe farmers have to figure it out themselves. Maybe the government shouldn't be in that business. Maybe the people couldn't afford to pay the taxes to pay the farmers. That was Harding's thought. He did cut taxes, Harding did, from the 70s down into the 50s. And he did privatize some of the government reserves. That's important. It was sort of like, I don't know if you've ever heard of Libertarians and Reason magazine. He did something that sounded like something out of Reason magazine. He privatized these excess assets of the government. That sounds great, energy, right? And what about the veterans? He wasn't going to pay them. No, we can't get into that habit, but he did make a very expensive compromise. He was going to build them hospitals. So you're not sending a check, but you're giving them a place to go with their festering leg, right? That's very important. And he worked hard in it. But remember what I said about temperament? Harding was a complicated man, and his party said no, and his platform said no, and he told himself his head was going to say no, but his heart said yes, right? Divided soul. So after he did this first round of hard stuff, he kind of rested. Well, 50%, that was an okay tax cut. He wasn't going to go below that. He got tired of appearing upright. He got tired of keeping up appearances. Mrs. Harding really liked to have parties in the White House, and they began to have parties in the White House. Remember I told you prohibition? And it said right there in the newspaper that people went to the Harding White House for, okay, open quote, food and action. Like, what kind of model is that? What's that? That sounds, I want to go to that party, right? That's interesting. And he liked to appoint his friends. He wasn't very rigorous. We have to be rigorous in our work to live up to our principles. He wasn't very rigorous about his appointments. And two of his appointments were fatal, and some of you will know what I'm getting at. One was that privatization project of the energy reserves. Instead of being a worthy libertarian privatization to get money for the government, he appointed all his friends who took the money instead of sharing it, and it was called Teapot Dome. Scandal, right? And why is that bad? Because the people don't trust you anymore if you have a scandal and just share the money with your friends, even if you didn't intend it, right? You're going to have to judge Harding's soul by yourself. I'll leave that to you. But the vet story is even worse because he appointed a friend, Mr. Forbes, and instead of building the hospitals right, Mr. Forbes took all the money, or most of it, as kickbacks from the contractors, and instead of having wonderful hospitals and being proud of them, Mr. Forbes ended up in Leavenworth, in the big prison, right? Big federal prison. And why is that bad? Again, because if you tell the vets you can't send them a check and you're going to build hospitals, and then your hospitals are no good, well, then their case for a check is that much stronger, isn't it? Right? And if you don't believe in a check, you're working against yourself. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the lady I mentioned before, said Harding was a slob in his presidency, and that's an important point. Not a bad man, but a slob. You can hurt by being a slob. Some people thought that everyone ought to have figured this out sooner, that Harding was a little bit lazy. Harding was extremely lovable. If he were here, he'd be apologizing to you and explaining why. And he said something quite true. He said that his friends betrayed him. I can take care of my enemies in a fight. He was a big man. He said, but it's my friends, my GD friends, who keep me walking the floor at night, right? Who let me down. And his father was a doctor and made what was then a very dirty joke about Warren Harding, the president, which I'll repeat to you if the president here will allow me. And the joke is the following. He said it was a good thing that his son, President Harding, wasn't a girl, because if Warren had been a girl, he would always be in the family way. I think you've heard of that phrase, the family way. I'll let you ask each other. So that's as dirty as it gets, and that was pretty bad. His own dad said that. Okay. So next year, the Harding revisionist, and Harding moves on. Unfortunately, he died. You probably know that in the summer of 1923. And Coolidge is in. And you're smart, right? August 1923, new president. Coolidge. Oh, he's a lame duck. That's what you're thinking, right? Only 1 year plus a couple months an election. And that's what a lot of people thought about Coolidge, because he was so quiet, because he made his business of getting people to underestimate him and so on. But remember what I said about temperament. Where Harding was divided, Coolidge was united. His plan said no and cut. His brain said no and cut. And his heart said no and cut. Have you guys ever taken one of those tests that says, well, what career are you going to have? You're going to be an actuary, or you're going to be a warrior, right? Those career tests?
Yes.
Right? If Coolidge did that, you know where he'd end up. He just was naturally cautious. And he knew also intellectually that if he was going to succeed in finishing what they'd said, he had to live his mission. He couldn't leave off for one day. Not in any area of his life, and his family suffered with this, right? And not in any area. You think I'm exaggerating. Think about even down to the pets. What do presidents name their pets? Barney, Mrs. Beasley, Bull, really nice names, you know, names that children like, right? But Coolidge got 2 lion cubs as a gift from the mayor of Johannesburg in South Africa. And what do you think he named those pets? Budget Bureau and Tax Reduction. Twins. Twins. And this, I mean, who here does econ? Raise your hand if you do econ. Okay, so there's a little battle about the relationship between budgets and tax rates, right? Oh, well, rates. These were twin lions, and he kept them the same weight. Steak, fed them steak. And they went to the zoo out in Northwest, right? Same weight. And why were they the same weight? There wasn't some big giant lion called tax reduction and some runt called budget bureau. They had to be the same because Coolidge believed you couldn't cut the budget, you couldn't cut the tax rate without keeping the budget low, right? He wasn't a total modern supply sider, not by temperament. They had to be even Steven. And Coolidge did come on like a sour pickle. I'm going to read you one Coolidge line so you can get a feel for it. People aren't used to this. I am for economy, by which he meant saving, right? And not a class called economics. Economy. I am for economy, and after that, I am for more economy. This one scared me to death. Okay, ready? We must have no carelessness in our dealings with public property, Coolidge said, or the expenditure of public money. Such a condition is characteristic of undeveloped people. Ooh, am I undeveloped? Right? You're sitting right up. People could see that he was disciplined, right? And he vowed, and this is like Lyndon Johnson, who's from another party, but was also quite a determined man, the vice president who became president in the 60s, that Coolidge vowed he was going to finish what he and the president, the late president whom he liked, had started and do everything, quote unquote, to perfection. Ooh, that's quite a high bar. You set for yourself. You're going to do everything to perfection. Am I ready? Taxes? Well, the 50% range that Harding had started, that wasn't enough. He was going to go down, down, down. And this wasn't just like an idea Coolidge had. It was a campaign. It was his own desert storm. He's going to get those taxes down. It was a serious, it almost sounds blasphemous to say it, but I'll say it. He took economics the way other presidents take wars, as a very serious endeavor for the country, and he wanted to, what we call, flatten the schedule, make the rates very low down there, and everyone paid taxes. And Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary, was also very silent, and they were going to do this together, and people wondered, how could 2 silent guys have a tax campaign? How could they even talk about it, because they had to have meetings? Well, it was said that Coolidge and the Treasury Secretary, who everyone was scared of, the Treasury Secretary, that they conversed in pauses. Right. Budget, and I want to mention they had different philosophies. Mellon did believe if you cut the rate on the tax, you might get more money for the government. Just like Walmart says, oh, we'll cut the price. How can Walmart afford to cut the price? Because they think they'll make it up on the volume. They'll sell more widgets. They'll get extra money. They'll be good, right? That's what Mellon believed about taxes. You cut the rate, there'll be more activity because people will be happy, and you'll get money that way. Budget, this is an amazing display by Coolidge. He didn't just budget, he budgeted ruthlessly. You know how to, I mean, some of you know with your parents or as parents that it's much easier to say, when you're unprepared in a meeting, you sort of have to say yes, because you're unprepared. So if you want to be ready to say no in the meeting, you really have to be prepared before, right? So for my book, I looked at his appointment book, Coolidge's appointment book, to see what the president did. And right before a cabinet meeting, when all the deans of his life, that is the cabinet members, came in to ask for money, Coolidge would have a meeting with his budget director to learn how to say no. So he'd be ready to say no to his colleagues in government or Congress. Very interesting. He met with his budget director up to 50 times a year, even when he got tired towards the end of his presidency. Well, nobody meets with a president 50 times a year, not even his family, right? So that was quite an arduous thing for Coolidge to do, but it did enable him to say no better. He did not hesitate to use shame, too, to get government departments to cut. He would have a command performance just like this, where you had to show up, mostly not up to you. sometimes, right? You just had to show up with the government twice a year. And at that event, Coolidge would walk around and his budget director would walk around and exhort the government to save, moral suasion. And they created a 2% club for the department that saved an extra 2% off its budget, and then you get what? A sticker? And then when they created, remember the country's growing at this time, then they created a 1% club, and you get what, another sticker? If you say 1%. And finally, Coolidge was from New England, and his partner, the budget director, was from Maine, so they had all the New England metaphors in their head. And so then they created a woodpecker club for that department in the US government that pecked away at its budget here and there. They would not relent. He also, I gave you 2 pencils at the beginning of the year. I see that you're using 1.5 pencils or battleships. I'll take my stub back. I'll take my half battleship. That is, he would actually take money back when he felt like he could, when he saw a department wasn't spending it well. He called taxes legalized larceny. Another way, that's strong, right? He didn't say good taxes, price of civilization. He said larceny. Some other Coolidge principles, how do you cut budgets? You kill laws. You stop laws. He had told his father long ago, they were a family of Vermont politicians. When his father was a lawmaker in the state capital of Vermont, Montpelier, he'd written him, do you ever advise your dad? Feels good, right? Written his dad some advice. Dear Dad, it's better to kill a bad law than to pass a good one. Oh, you don't hear that very often either, right? Maybe there are too many laws, and maybe fewer. So Coolidge, Harding had vetoed only 6 times. Coolidge vetoed 50. And since I've already made the character description, maybe some of you can guess, and I know Peterson's in my class, who else is in the class? What was Coolidge's favorite device for vetoing? The pocket veto. What's a pocket veto? Well, remember, he's silent. In the pocket veto, you can veto, we have to veto in the recess. The law is passed right before the recess, the legislation, and then the president just doesn't do anything. He just lets it die, puts it in his pocket. And the cute thing about the pocket veto is you don't have to write any message, silent cow, right? And Congress cannot override your veto. It takes a bit of art, though. You have to get them to pass that legislation right before the recess for it to fall into the recess. So you have to kind of trick Congress into, getting that law through, and then wham, you kill it. So Coolidge wasn't just good at the pocket veto. He was a maestro. He was a regular Isaac Stern of the pocket veto. Right? He would just, over and over again. People will study a president for a vulnerable area, right? You want to get the president to spend. Coolidge was from a farm place. His family had a cheese factory. What's a cheese factory? In the 20s, before electricity has gone all the way. It's an exercise in economic desperation. You can't get your milk anywhere because the train doesn't come to your town, and you don't have a refrigerator, so you need to make your protein less perishable, so you make cheese. Coolidge knew all about agricultural suffering. But nonetheless, he wasn't sure that the government could help. So there's a meeting, and an important mendicant, a lobbyist, comes to see Coolidge to ask him about the farm subsidy, because Coolidge knows about farm suffering, his dad, and so on, his village. And all Coolidge says, and I want you to listen to the pauses, because they're more important than the language. Silence, silence, pause, pause. Well, I'm Coolidge. Farmers never have made much money. Pause. Don't suppose they ever will. Pause. Don't suppose there's much the government can do about it. Pause. No. Very different. No. What else can I say? He fished with worms. He was not a fly fisherman. That earned the contempt of President Hoover, who was an awesome fly fisherman. But legislation on his desk to help the fisheries. Did Coolidge sign it? No, you cannot sign stuff for yourself if you're telling other people no. You can't do for your own what you know when you reject other people. And that phrase is in Coolidge's history. You think I'm joking, right? You're thinking about, today we talk about pork. Government spends on pork, on little gifts, little constituencies, what we call demo grants in political economy sometimes. Coolidge took that literally. There was a housekeeper at the White House, Mrs. Jaffray, who had this big spread for all the important diplomats who were coming for dinner, and she wanted to show President Coolidge what she was going to serve, and she let him in, and he looked around, and he didn't say, "Good job, Mrs. Jaffray, feeding these dignitaries." All he said was, "It looks like an awful lot of ham to me that you're serving." To the White House guys, right? And pretty soon Mrs. Jaffray wasn't there anyone, and he had a thriftier housekeeper from Massachusetts, where he was from. Well, these stories, didn't make them very popular in Washington. And you think about, a president, it's a natural celebrity. Even doesn't matter what your party is. You want to be with the president, right? You want to be near a president. You want to know what color his hair is. It's the closest thing to American royalty, right? So it's kind of like the MasterCard commercial. See the president when you're in Washington just walking around, that's real good. Meet with the president in a room like this, that's pretty darn good, even better. But what's the best thing? Eat breakfast or dinner with the president in his own personal dining room with his own personal sausage that he made on his Vermont farm. Priceless, right? Anyone would want to do it. And the most amazing thing about Coolidge was he did have these meals, especially breakfasts. He did serve his own maple syrup from his own farm. And guess what? The lawmakers didn't come. What? They're missing a chance to lobby? They were so disillusioned with all the times he said no. And the housekeeper in the White House kept a list, a malicious housekeeper, of the excuses these lawmakers made rather than sup with their president. Oh my gosh. Well, Coolidge, you can guess Coolidge was not a very good tipper, right? So the usher in the White House, whose name was Ike, was pretty unhappy. I'm going to read you the excuses they made because it's so funny rather than come to these precious breakfasts. Okay. Senator Heflin regrets sick. Okay. This one, Senator Pittman. Is anyone? Senator Pittman, silver senator. He was a big silver advocate. Regrets sick. Okay. And this one I really like. It's so lame. Senator Reed of Missouri regrets sick friend. Like the best one of all is Senator Norris, and if you know history, you know Senator Norris was a big progressive, the opposite of what Coolidge is. And you know what it says under his name at his invitation? : unable to locate. So I tell you all this, what about the other side of it? Well, guess what? The money was flowing in from the tax cuts. Kind of worked. The lower rates did bring in extra money, and if you go back to the statistics of income, which is where they are right on the IRS website, you can see that the rate cuts brought in far more money than they thought, and sometimes even more on top of what the estimate was. Oh wow, there was more activity when people weren't subject to legalized larceny. It kind of terrified Coolidge actually to see that much money. You know what's going to happen. The government's going to spend it, right? So, but their little experiment, his and Andrew Mellon's, worked. And in Washington, people began to see the value of this strange president. One was the journalist Walter Lippmann, who was a very subtle writer. He didn't like Coolidge, but he was not unintelligent about human nature. And this is what he wrote about Coolidge. The economy's going great. Here we go. This White House, the Coolidge White House, is extremely sensitive to the first symptom of any desire on the part of Congress or of the executive departments to want to do something. The skill with which Mr. Coolidge applies his wet blanket is technically marvelous. There has never been Mr. Coolidge's equal in the art of deflating interest. The naive statesman might assume that it is desirable to interest the people in their government, that indignation at evil is useful. Right? But Mr. Coolidge is more sophisticated. He has discovered the value of diverting attention from the government, and with an exquisite subtlety that amounts to genius, he has used dullness and boredom as political device. What's going on? Strikes are going down, but wages are not down. Oh, we don't need the unions in this country. Unemployment is below 5%. That's what President Obama longs for, right? Unemployment below 5%. What else? You know, sometimes you'll hear the 20s, this is the 20s, assailed. How many of you have read Great Gatsby? Just about everyone, right? Every single high schooler reads Great Gatsby. Don't write about it in your college application. This is so popular, right? Great Gatsby. Well, Great Gatsby, your impression of the 20s is rich people tromp on the rest, run over them with their yellow car, right? Poor people. That's not the picture of the 20s that was really there. I think I can contend that, and that Coolidge gave, because what happened in the 20s? People got electricity. That's really good, right? You can have appliances, you can have a washing machine, you can have a dryer, and you can have a radio, play jazz music if you're allowed, right? You can get an automobile, first a Model T or a Model A. This was a very good decade for the middle class, whatever the fiction suggests, right? And you want to look at it quite seriously. I do a lot of work internationally looking at developing countries, and especially with India. And we know what happens with India. We know very well through polling what the Indians define as moving from poor to working class or poor to middle class. And you know what the number one thing for that is? The criterion, the gold standard of class definition? Indoor plumbing. When you get into, you are no longer poor if you have indoor plumbing. You are good to go. Your family can move if you have a toilet. Well, what decade did people get indoor plumbing in the United States? The 20s. Went from 1 or 2 households in 10 to over 5. I rest my case. The toilet argument. Coolidge, prosperity was wonderful. Another result, people were inspired to do things, that normalcy I spoke of. If you study patents, it's a great dissertation, it's a great college paper. The patent rate, people trying to figure out how to make money off their ideas, went through the roof in the 1920s. We admire it even today. Because they thought, well, they might get to keep their money, the government might not be in the way. It was a very optimistic decade. Other takeaways from the period, temperament matters, right? Coolidge finished what he started. Laws matter. The Budget and Accounting Act, we want to give Harding credit for that, really helped Coolidge too. He wouldn't have been able to achieve what he achieved without certain laws and certain commitments from his predecessors. Respect for federalism matters. What are you pulling the federal, that is Washington, back for? You're doing it so the states can have some say. And this time the states are more important than Washington, and they kind of want to keep it that way. They didn't manage to, right, later, but for the time, Coolidge was not just a Federalist, he was a ferocious Federalist. How do we know? How did he describe the United States? He always said the United States in plural. The United States are going to do this, because the state component was important to him. I think, and especially for this school, it's important to mention is faith. What's another reason you're pulling back the federal government? Because it's going in areas that aren't really the area of the government, that might be community area, state area, or the area of what he called the area of the spirit, things of the spirit. He was a man of great faith, though he didn't advertise it, very modest, and he believed there were some things government just couldn't do for you. So you want to stop asking for it and look to your community or to yourself. For that. I can't emphasize that too much. I hope we discuss about it. I don't know what else to say. The economy did great. Coolidge had an election. So this mean naysayer had that election in 1924. Now there was a third party running. And usually when there's a third party, which party does the third party hear? The Democrats or the Republicans? It's usually the Republicans. So there was Ross Perot, who ran for president as a third party, and the Democrat was Bill Clinton, and the Republican was the first President Bush. And who won? Bill Clinton, because he took a plurality. Ross Perot, the third party, took 17%, and Bill Clinton took some kind of plurality, a little more than President Bush. And those votes that President Bush lost were taken away. They were ones he lost to Ross Perot. So in 1924, there was a similar three-party situation. Progressives, populists, Republicans and Democrats. And as with Bill Clinton, guess what? The progressive populists came out of the Republican side, right? And so people thought, well, maybe the Republicans will lose. But Coolidge won. He won so handily, he didn't just take a plurality, he took an absolute majority. That means the naysayer beat Democrats and progressives combined. Very interesting. And their GOP is a neurotic party. So when they wanted Coolidge, just like now, they wanted Coolidge to run in 28 because he was so incredibly popular because he always undersold. And he didn't because he believed it was immodest, and they had a nervous breakdown. They said, well, Hoover can run, but he has to run on Coolidge policy. And that's another lecture, whether Hoover was actually like Coolidge. He wasn't. But they were so committed to Coolidge, they almost couldn't handle having any other candidate. He was that great a political success. So I'm going to close and ask for questions, and one will be, did Coolidge cause the Great Depression? People in my course are learning about that, and now it'll be like Coolidge and answer with one syllable and say, no. But we can talk more about that. And I know the second question will be, could he ever happen today with television? He wasn't that handsome. And the answer is yes, and we can talk more about that too. Wow. Thank you very much.
Questions for
Is there a
Amity
young
Shlaes?
man back there? Young man right here. Need some ladies too, though. Maybe
Hello.
some teachers.
Thank you very much. So because this is, kind of with the title of comparing Coolidge and Reagan, I was wondering, one of the things reason why Reagan spent so much was he was sort of trying to outspend the Soviet Union in order to help them to collapse. So if there was a similar situation with Coolidge, how do you think he would have handled something like that?
And your name is?
I'm sorry, Joseph Holmes.
Joseph, great question. Great question. And every president has a couple warts. Coolidge's wart was he was for tariffs, which is an international thing, put tariffs on foreign companies. And if you want to criticize Coolidge, I'm not sure he was as good as some other presidents at foreign policy. So the argument for Reagan is he was spending to end the Cold War, and maybe he did by show of military force. However, I want to answer that not all of us believe in intervention every time, right? We want to be selective about government intervention. And Coolidge is quite inspiring in that regard because he was, I don't think he was an isolationist. There are wars, but he was quite hesitant to intervene arbitrarily because he didn't know if we had the power to establish democracy everywhere. He thought you might work another way, which is through commerce or faith. He understood about missionaries, right? He went to a college that was for ministers at the time, Amherst. So when he had a foreign policy issue, say Mexico, there's a war in Mexico, he would be concerned, what's happening to U.S. citizens there? What's happening to U.S. property there? And it wasn't just because he only cared about money. It's because property, if you protect property domestically or abroad, you're protecting individuals. And so he saw the world in terms of property rights, which is very different from the way we would see matters now. I would love to see the paper defending his great foreign policy legislation, which was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Kellogg-Briand Pact, what's that? I mean, that's like normalcy. People laugh when they teach it. It outlawed war. Well, what a joke. Pact with a lot of countries to outlaw war. What a loser Coolidge was. How naive, right? But the Kellogg-Briand Pact had embedded in it a great principle, which is if we respect the rule of law, then others may as well. We try to bring countries into the law and to be civilized, but we do it in a modest way. Maybe Woodrow Wilson is overstepping, League of Nations, all that, World Court. We'll just do it in a small way and say, well, I'll agree not to respect the rule of law. And that's Wilsonian. Okay, it's interesting. Maybe some of us would go that way. So I think he's an interesting study. One warrior, the man who became Haile Selassie from Ethiopia, sent Coolidge a big, giant gold shield with jewels in it. And this shield is actually in Vermont. You can see it sometimes at Plymouth Notch where the Coolidge Foundation is. My God, sign of force and loyalty, right, from Africa. And what did Coolidge send back? 4 law books. Right? It's a different answer with some merit to it. Thank you for the question. Do you want to pick? I want to be sure and pick a lady too. Where's the lady question? That's a male. Okay. That male is okay, but the next one is a lady. Okay.
Thank you for taking my question.
Oh, it's okay. I'm not prejudiced.
Hi, I'm Seth. Thank you for your talk. So last year, the Farm Bill was passed, a $1 trillion bill that is actually 80% food stamps. And so I'm curious about if the farm bills that were attempted to pass in Coolidge's day had similar, very different, food stamps have, you could say, what does that have to do with a farm bill? Or why call it a farm bill if 80% of the spending actually goes to food stamps? So I'm curious if Coolidge had to deal with things like that and how he did that, and how could a president deal with that kind of stuff?
That's a great question. I mean, what it does is it pushes, supposing you have farm legislation but you don't want to do it, but then you attach food stamps to it, well, who would turn that down, right? You attach something that makes the bill unrejectable, unvetoable, because it's so compelling. Coolidge thought that some farmers were hungry, but maybe it would be better for them to go to the city and work in the factory, which is indeed what happened. Of course, of history, maybe we don't need so many people on the farms. We have just as good farming productivity as the share of the economy. Farms are large, but the population working there is smaller, as we noted before. So he didn't like to be held hostage by that kind of thing. The Farm Bill at the time was not about food stamps. It was about regulating payments to farmers, the question of whether you reduce production to drive up prices, and I don't have them in front of me, but some of the most eloquent writing of Coolidge is the vetoes that he did write, including his veto of, he just said we can't mess with prices that way by trying to pretend we can control supply and demand. And he saw through farming legislation to the essence of its microeconomic meaning, which is hard to do. On principle, there was a Katrina in the period, which was the flood of the Mississippi, and Coolidge did not go down, just like President Bush didn't go down. And it wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he felt if the chief executive went down to the disaster, then the chief executive would have to sign big permanent aid legislation for the disaster area, and he opposed that. So this was a topic in his mind every day, an incredible pity for the pain of others, but he just didn't think the federal government would always be the vehicle, and he was very wary of being held hostage by compelling items, puppies, food stamps, little children, the kind of things that you sell legislation with. Okay, where's the female?
One more quick question from a female.
Hi, my name's Sophia. My question is, what do you think would have happened if Coolidge would have ran for and gotten elected second term? Would it have been similar to Reagan's second term at all?
Well, thank you, Sophia, very much. He probably, that's a counterfactual. He would have won. Is Reagan's second term bad? Reagan's second term had some good things. It's where he got his tax legislation through, for example. Would it have been a good period for him? Probably not, because the stock market went too high in his time. He just wasn't in charge of the stock market, right? The federal government didn't even regulate the stock market. There was no SEC. So he might have had a tough term because there would have been a crash, but he would have said, well, that's just the way it is. And you want to imagine the expectation of the president was much lower than Coolidge's life, and Miss S knows this because she's in our class, about parallels the life of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, because the DJ, which was created right down here, or spent most of its life right down here, came online initially in 1895, which is the time that Coolidge got out of Amherst and went into the world. And he had seen the market crash a whole lot of times without any big depression. it crashed 47%, as we studied in our class, in the early 20s, and nobody even noticed, right? We don't even remember that depression. That's a forgotten depression. So I don't think it would have been pleasant, because the market was so high in the late 20s, it would fall on his watch, and it would be harder to say no, and that would have happened. But I think he would have made it through the term, if that's what you're asking, standing on his principles.